This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 37 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, September 10th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section, spelled C-E-N-T-R-E in this particular issue. Miss Lila Fisher closes her camp, the Birches, where she has spent the summer and returns this week to her teaching in Boston. Lila was the nickname of Eliza Capon Fisher, one of the daughters of Alvin Fisher and Amanda Tower. They had 12 children. 3 died young, but the others had notable careers, mostly as teachers and lawyers, and mostly in the Westford and Lowell area. Miss Clyde Carpenter has been visiting her grandmother, Mrs. Abby Tower Hamlin. Mrs. Harry N. Jakes, J-A-Q-U-E-S, and daughter Dorothy, who have been spending the summer with Mr. and Mrs. William Sutherland, returned this week to their home in Malden. Leon F. Hildreth enters the Lowell High School at the beginning of the fall term next Monday. Mrs. William Seifer, née Jenny MacDonald, is ill at her home, and our village nurse, Miss Mary Morn, is in attendance. Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Marden and son Everett and Mr. and Mrs. John Copeland of Woburn were Labor Day guests at Mr. and Mrs. Alonzo H. Sutherland's. Henry Benoit is seriously sick with typhoid fever. A trained nurse is in attendance. 14 were represented from this town at the CE convention at Littleton on Labor Day. That's CE is the Christian Endeavor. It's one of the organizations within one of the churches in Westford Center. They report a profitable session and a good time. The Unitarian Church has been undergoing extensive repairs and improvements. Will reopen for services on Sunday, September 18th. That's what we know as the First Parish Church. The Parkerville School will open next Monday. This postponement was due to the prevalence of the whooping cough in the neighborhood. The town safe in the town hall has been fitted this week with steel shelves in place of the wooden ones that have been in use so long. Among our young people going to teach in other towns are Miss Edna Ferguson to Beverly, Miss Jenny Ferguson to Presque Isle, Maine, Miss Edith Bicknell to Boylston, Miss Edith A. Wright to Ayer, Miss Stella Hartford to Carlisle, Archie Hartford to Norfolk, Miss Ruth Tuttle to Winthrop, and Mrs. Jenny Chandler and Lila Fisher to Boston. Next, we have an obituary. Gilmer Stone died at his home in this village late Wednesday evening. His death was not wholly unexpected, for he had been a sufferer for several years with heart trouble, and death came as a release from a prison house of pain. Mr. Stone was born in Saco, Maine, 71 years and 6 months ago. His family removed to Lowell when he was 3 years old, and later he came to Westford, where he has made his home for 53 years. His home, the later years of his life, has been in the house directly opposite the town hall. He married in early life to Miss Elvira M. Layton, eldest daughter of the late Amos Layton. A son born to them died in infancy. Besides his widow, he is survived by a sister, Mrs. Baxter B. Kimball of Norwich, Connecticut. Mr. Stone was a veteran of the Civil War, having served 3 years in Company G, 33rd Regiment. Funeral services will be held at his late home on Saturday at 2 p.m. The 33rd Maths Regiment was a regiment that a number of Westford men served in. The next section is the Grange section. Westford Grange held its regular meeting at the town hall Thursday evening of last week. After the transaction of routine business, a miscellaneous program was given. Recitations by Mrs. Pearlie E. Wright were much enjoyed. There was also readings by Mrs. Sutherland, duet by Mrs. Grieg and Mrs. Sutherland, piano solo by Miss Grace Robinson, and a song by Mrs. S.B. Wright. This Grange has received an invitation to Chelmsford Grange on September 22nd for their annual Neighbors' Night, and preparations are underway to present a good program. At the Middlesex North Pomona Grange meeting at Lowell Friday, Westford Grange was represented by 8 members. It was a good session, the time in the morning being occupied by an experience meeting on spraying. The next section is auto race. The pony auto race, which has been engrossing the youthful attention of the participants in the way of preparation for some time, came off as scheduled on Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. The cars showed much ingenuity in construction, and the course was the same as in previous years, beginning at the top of Graniteville Hill Road. There were 7 cars in the race, driven by the following boys: Alfred Sutherland, Edward Blodgett, Harry Sears, Bertram Sutherland, Joseph Perkins, Fletcher Abbott, and Daniel Maloney. Each driver was accompanied by his mechanician. Fletcher Abbott covered the course in the shortest time and received the trophy, which was a silver loving cup, and his mechanician, we would call it mechanic, was Clifford Woods, also received a like memento. After the race, Mrs. John C. Abbott served ice cream and cake to the participants of the day's events. These pony races, as they call them, were what we would call soapbox derby races, where the cars coasted downhill. The next section is the About Town section. The regular monthly meeting of the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, was held with Mrs. Seavey on Wednesday afternoon. The following delegates to the county convention to be held at Marlborough September 20th were chosen: Mrs. Frank C. Hildreth, Mrs. Homer M. Seavey, Mrs. Jeanette Wright, Mrs. Emery J. Whitney, Mrs. Ada Day, and Mrs. John Warren Day. Voted a sum of money for the benefit of the Literary Bureau. After making our reports for the county and having the usual inflow and outgo of hospitality, the meeting adjourned. Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Spaulding, Charlotte Prescott, Gertrude Fletcher, Mrs. William Edwards, and Reuben Taylor leave Monday on the Grand Tour, including Niagara Falls, Toronto, St. Lawrence River, Thousand Islands, Long Sault, and Lachine Rapids, and Montreal, thence to Brookside. Colonel Edwin D. Metcalf has added liberally to his already liberal gifts in beautifying the interior of the Unitarian Church by the gift of a mahogany pulpit and colonial rail in front of the choir. In consequence of the newness and incompleteness of the situation, the church will be closed next Sunday. One of his previous gifts was the stained glass window behind the choir and the altar that was dedicated in memory of his mother. Pearl Harmon has sold the Oak Knoll Farm of 5 acres on Hildreth Street to Lowell ladies. Per the Middlesex County North Registry deed book, book 456, page 62, Luella A. Harmon, wife of Pearl Harmon, sold their 5-acre home to Julia B. Clifford of Minneapolis, Minnesota on September 13, 1910. Their Westford home was at 73 Hildreth Street at the intersection with Flag Road, giving this intersection the name Harmon's Corner. In 1911, the Harmons moved to Chelmsford. Charles W. Whitney and C.R.P. Decatur are the only farmers in eastern Westford that can properly be classified as successful in raising watermelons. Perry Taylor Snow celebrated the 4th anniversary of birthday remembrances and experimental living Tuesday with other youths and sweets and grays of older years. Perry was the grandson of Samuel Law Taylor, who wrote the About Town section of the Westford Wardsman. Miss Sarah Page, just north of Westford Station, while under the influence of partial unconsciousness, fell, striking on the stove, causing a bad scalp wound, tearing the scalp back without respect to the laws of surgery. Dr. Blaney was called. Next, we have the Forge Village section. A very pretty dancing party was held in Abbott Hall on Saturday evening by the summer residents who have been enjoying camp life on the shore of Forge Pond. The affair was in charge of Mr. and Mrs. Freeman and Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, and guests were present from Everett, Malden, Melrose, and Cambridge. Music was furnished by Miss Sarah Precious and James H. Brown of this village, and Norman Nichols and Miss E. Nichols of Everett. Miss Nichols is a talented musician and, like her brother, also plays several instruments. Mr. and Mrs. John Sullivan have returned home after a pleasant trip to Boston and New York City. While at Boston, they made arrangements for their son, Daniel, to enter Harvard Preparatory School. He will commence his school term on September 14th. This was probably James E. Sullivan, who was born in 1905. The flower garden of Mrs. Actually, that's probably not right. If he was born in 1905, and he would only be 5 years old, so it must be another Sullivan. The flower garden of Mrs. M.A. Lowther was visited Monday by person or persons on mischief bent. Blossoms were torn from the plants and destroyed. Others were cut down and carried away. They were not content with destroying the flower garden that has given much pleasure to its owners, but the lawn swing was turned upside down, and this could not have been done by small children. If the persons are caught, they will be severely dealt with, as a fine of $10 can be imposed upon those stealing flowers. Mr. and Mrs. William Weaver entertained a house party over the holidays. Miss Teresa Lowther and Miss Rachel H. Cherry have returned from a delightful outing at Revere and Nantasket Beach. They also enjoyed an automobile ride to the principal places of interest in and around Boston. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Catchpole spent the last of the summer holidays at Old Orchard Beach, Maine, and other interesting places along the Maine coast. Joseph Bennett, Sr., has been confined to his home the past 2 weeks by illness. His daughter, Mrs. Ellsworth of Providence, Rhode Island, and his son-in-law, August Myers of Boston, spent the holiday with him. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Coley of Worcester returned home on Monday after a pleasant visit spent with Mr. and Mrs. John Edwards. Miss Hattie Northrup has returned home from Portland, Maine, where she attended the Deaf Mutes Convention, over 300 being in attendance. The mayor of Portland chartered 2 special cars and entertained the members at Old Orchard Beach. The convention will be held next year in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Harry Morton of Bridgeport, Connecticut, was a recent visitor of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton. A little daughter, Mary Laura Juliette Benoit, was born on Saturday, September 3rd. Actually, the vital records give September 2nd, to Mr. and Mrs. James Benoit of Central Street. Miss Stella B. Karkin of this village and Miss Alice Barton of Lowell, both popular employees of the Fred C. Church Insurance Office, left Saturday morning on a trip to the White Mountains, the principal point of interest being Bethlehem, New Hampshire, where they will be registered at the Central House for the next 2 weeks. Joseph Cannell, while at work at the Daniel Gage Ice Houses on Wednesday, had the misfortune to cut his foot with an ice hook, cutting a gash quite deep and narrowly missing an artery. Dr. Blaney attended him. The washroom and dryer room of the Abbott Worsted Company of this village shut down on Wednesday and Thursday of this week to make necessary changes from steam power to electricity. Wilbert E. Parsons has sold all of his real estate and will dispose of his household and personal effects at auction on Saturday afternoon. Next is the Graniteville section. Miss Ruth M. Furbish, pianist, played with the American Orchestra of Ayer on Labor Day morning and evening. The Labor Day holiday began in 1882 as an attempt by the Central Labor Union to have a day off for the working man. It became a federal holiday by an act of Congress in 1894. Fred Parker, janitor of the Sargent School here, has given the school building an entire overhauling and thorough cleaning, and everything, including the fixing of the grounds, has been done before the opening of the schools, which commenced on Tuesday morning, September 6th. Owing to the resignation of the principal, Gerald Decatur, there has been a change in the corps of teachers. Miss Izzy Parker as principal. Miss Genevieve Jansen of Lowell has taken the room formerly taught by Miss Parker. Miss Bannister and Miss Dunn still have the same rooms as before. Miss Lillian Hughes, the eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Hughes, former residents of this village, but now located in Warwick, Rhode Island, is now visiting relatives in this village. Court Graniteville, F of A, that's Foresters of America, held a very interesting meeting in its rooms on Thursday evening. Considerable business of importance was transacted, and the following committee appointed to have charge of the anniversary dance that will be held in October: Robert J. McCarthy, Albert R. Waugh, Joseph B. Riney, Edward Spinner, G. E. Denio. It is expected that the dance will be held in Westford as formerly. Reverend Louis F. Havermale, pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church here, that is Graniteville, who has been spending the last few weeks at his boyhood home in Canton, Illinois, has returned, and services were resumed Sunday at the usual hour. Mrs. Maud Robinson of Westford has been a recent visitor in this village for a few years. The funeral of Mildred Edna, the 7-month-old baby of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Brooks, took place on Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. The services that were held at the home were conducted by Reverend L. F. Havermale of the Methodist Episcopal Church and were largely attended. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery, Westford. For a child so young, the floor tributes were unusually numerous, which testified to the high esteem in which the family is held in this village. The Ladies' Aid Society of the M.E. Church held an interesting meeting at the home of Mrs. Harry N. Fletcher's Thursday afternoon, September 8th. Mrs. W.C. Wright is now enjoying a brief vacation at Provincetown. Cameron Circle, CF of A, that's Companions of the Foresters of America, held a social dance in Healy's Hall last Saturday night. The Imperial Orchestra furnished music for dancing, and at intermission refreshments were served. Wesley O. Hawks, the genial station agent of the Boston and Maine line, has a swarm of bees that are always on the job, and so far this season he has obtained 115 pounds of honey from his hives. Although Mr. Hawks sprained his ankle recently, he remarked that in spite of the pain, he could not help but feel sweet-tempered when he thought of those bees. A pretty party composed of William Sargent, Oscar A. Nelson, Thomas Denio, Andrew Johnson, and Fred Reed visited the farm of Charles and Fred Blodgett a few days ago, the trip being made in Mr. Sargent's automobile. The time was pleasantly spent in an interesting ball game, followed by croquet and other games, after which Mrs. Blodgett, mother of the boys, furnished refreshments. The whole affair was very enjoyable, and all returned at a reasonable hour after having a very good time. Work has resumed here on Tuesday morning in both mill and shop after Labor Day. The mill was stopped a week before for necessary repairs. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Riney and Miss Ada and Miss Alice C. Sheehan were recent guests during the holiday. Mrs. Alec McDonald of Westford is visiting at the home of her father, T.A. Riney, and at the present time is suffering from malaria. Mrs. Wesley O. Hawks and her daughter, Mrs. Alfred Hartford of Westford, left here last week to attend the funeral of Mr. Hawks' nephew, who died in Amherst. The North Chelmsford Baseball Club visited here on Labor Day morning, and in their postponed game with the Granitevilles met defeat at the hands of the locals by the score of 7-3. In spite of the threatening weather, there was a goodly number present, and the game proved to be interesting from start to finish. For the home team, the hitting of Hughes and Gilson and the battery work of McCarthy and Ledwith were features. Curtin, formerly of the Richmonds, who pitched for North Chelmsford, did good work in the box and led his team in batting. In the fourth inning, the opposing team pulled off a pretty fielding stunt that drew applause from the rooters on both sides. Healy, the first man up for Graniteville, drew a pass. On a Texas leaguer by Hanson, he was advanced to second. 2 men on bases. With Ledwith at the bat, the hit and run signal was given. Ledwith met the ball and sent it on a line over Curtin's head. Curtin knocked it down, juggled it, and shot it to Donnelly, doubling up Hanson. Donnelly then threw it to Thatcher at second, putting out Healy, thereby completing as pretty a triple play as has been seen on the ground for a long time. It was certainly fast work. And that's the news in Westford. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.